Okay, open letter is a genre of rhetoric. It's actually the same genre as MLK is using. I remember she did it in Letter from Birmingham Jail. So I'm gonna find my notes all over the place today. Open letter. All right, you ready? You're ready for the definition?
Yeah.
I'll be ready to give it to you when you stop talking.
In capital letters.
Okay, a letter that is intended to be read by a wide audience. A letter that is intended to be read by a wide audience. And your examples do two of them. Do Between the World and Me, book that you just read, excerpt from, and do Letter from Birmingham Jail. Both of those are open letters. And for whatever reason on the AP test, a lot of times they use open letters for their rhetorical analysis essay. And I think part of that is because it's so interesting to talk about audience with open letters. So an open letter is geared like towards one person specifically. Like for Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, he's speaking directly to his son. But then he obviously intended it for publication. And so at the same time, he's addressing this wider audience. Same with MLK. He's addressing it to this narrow audience of the clergymen, the 8 clergymen, but he always intended to publish it in his book. Actually, the story behind Letter from Birmingham Jail is that it was published early. His lawyer, here's the story. A little bit off track, but he was in Birmingham Jail because he was arrested for what's called marching without a permit, parading without a permit. Actually, that's what they call it, parading without a permit. Basically, he was like, hey guys, I'm coming to your town. I'm going to protest. You want to give me the permit to protest? And the sheriff of that town, the chief of police, Bull Connor, said, no, you can't march here. And so they wouldn't give him the permit. So Martin Luther King had the march anyway, and he was arrested for parading without a permit. So then he was in prison, and his lawyer was visiting him to try and get him out of prison. And he would bring the newspaper. So Martin Luther King wrote Letter from Birmingham Jail on scraps of newspaper, like in the margins. And he would the lawyer would like smuggle out the piece of paper in his notes and then assemble it later. And Martin Luther King was intending to publish this in his book called Why We Can't Wait. But the lawyer was like, whether this was right or not, he made a decision to publish it early. He sent it to an Atlanta newspaper and said, publish this nationwide. So it was distributed nationwide when MLK was still in prison, but after he wrote the letter. And then later he published it in his book. So that's an open letter too, though, because he did intend to publish it. And even if he hadn't intended, any letter that gets published for wide distribution would be called an open letter. All right, now why do you think it'd be important to know if something was an open letter when you're thinking about the audience? Let's talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates. So he has his son as an audience, and he has some sort of wider audience. Okay, tell me what's important about his son that we understand if we're going to understand this piece of rhetoric. Yeah, Joseph.
Like comparatively to like writing to a wider audience, he's African American. Obviously, his son can be African American.
Yeah.
He's this book is gonna. He mentioned like writing it, like how the day of his life was gonna go as, and living like with his culture and comparatively to a wider audience.
Yeah.
Where when people write to a wider audience, it's generally more like it's generalized. Where this has like a clear set like topic in it, like more topic, more clear topic.
Okay, good. So focused on a specific life and how this specific life could go. For a wider audience to interpret that, they would have to generalize that. Yeah.
I think going off of that, like a family member, you can be a lot more personal. So when you're writing to an audience, you kind of have to give context and background information. Yeah. If you're just writing to like your son, you get something maybe it's personal to just those two. And
yeah, and do you see how he tries to balance that so far in his essay? It's like he says things like, I watched you watch the Michael Garner trial, on TV. he probably would not have to give his own son that much context, but because he is also intending this for this wider audience, he gives that context to us. So it's like this balancing act between that. Yeah.
Well, one thing I found really profound was he was talking a lot about how his world is different from the world that he grew up in.
Yes.
And he has a lot more to live for because, like, his father, there were so many different things. He's like, well, I didn't have the opportunity to go to those things and have those things. So his son has more to lose. He's trying to prepare him in case he doesn't have those things.
Okay, good. So he's noticing these sort of changes in culture and history for his son specifically, and that's going to be important for understanding the rhetoric. What else do we need to know about his son, do you think? Like the demographics of this personal audience to really understand the rhetoric. Yeah, Keely? Yeah, how old is he roughly in this?
14.
14?
15, 14.
Okay, so he's like around 14, so like kind of just entering his teenage years. Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah, do we? I mean, does he talk about it yet? Later in the book we find out. Yeah. Nuclear family, I think, is important here. And they're pretty affluent. Ta-Nehisi Coates, even at the point of writing this book, I mean, this book made him wealthy, really wealthy. Like he has an essay about how wealthy he is now that's like delightful. But he even before this, he was doing really well. He graduated from Howard University, which is like a really great school, and was writing for the Atlantic. So he's from this like affluent nuclear family. Yeah.
I need to know what his relationship is.
Okay. What do we think? What does it seem like so far?
A good relationship, but maybe a little bit of tough love.
Okay. Maybe some tough love with the son, but not as much as his father with him, it seems like. Yeah, okay. A blunt, kind of like, he's not afraid of the truth with his son. Okay, good. Luke?
His son's kind of young and naive compared to the audience. So
Yeah.
he kind of has to explain kind of almost how the real world works.
Good. Yeah, he seems to be a little naive, and part of that is what Elsa was talking about, where the history is different of where they're growing up and how they're growing up. And so when he hears like bad news or when he hears of police shootings, his dad is not surprised at all, but the son is quite surprised, and it's like crushing him because of that naivete. So it feels like he needs to prepare him for that. Okay, now wider audience. Now this gets a little bit maybe more not controversial, but there's an argument to be made here about who the wider audience is. So for any text about race, we need to think about whether the wider audience is multiracial, whether it's specifically geared towards one group, and sort of like what their attitudes are towards racism, prejudice, discrimination. What do you think this audience is, Oscar? Yes. Yeah, good.
Based on this kind of thing, I think he's interested in all of
Okay, good.
America and his feelings towards America are obviously not very positive.
Okay, good. So do you think if his feelings towards America are not very positive, do you think he is, I think there's a way to divide Americans between like the super patriotic, like, you know, gung-ho Americans and maybe more critical of their own country. Do you think he is trying to like attack people's patriotism and say like you shouldn't be feeling that way anymore, or do you think he is speaking a little bit to the choir and saying here's why we should be critical?
I think it's
Okay.
feel pretty strongly that this is like fairly ingrained in people. So I don't think he's really aiming towards the people that have really strong feelings about it already.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think if he was, he failed. So I don't think he necessarily is trying to say, hey, you who like, you know, I don't know, you Klans members, come over to my side. I don't think he's going that far, but I also don't think he's going that far with like nationalism either. Hey, you who believe that America's done no wrong, come over to my side. I think he's not going to go there. Elsa?
I think that he has very high expectations and he expects them to be met. You know, because like America, like what he said in the interview, like I feel like he does love America. He loves what it can be. He sees the promise in it, but he's disappointed when it doesn't meet those expectations. And I feel like he's kind of calling people to like, we can do better. This could be a better world.
So do you think that his audience is also disappointed in America?
Yeah.
Okay. Gracie?
He mentions like lots of different like presidents, and when the other guy that like had negative feedback for his thing was like talking about like for every this kind of person there's an
Oh, yeah.
Abraham Lincoln, and then
Yeah.
he's like, but Abraham Lincoln is actually just a very like unique person. Like there's not lots of people that actually had like the passions and like the ideas that Abraham.
Yeah, his point there is that like there's more of a pattern of racism than there is a pattern of what these days we call anti-racist. That was a term that came out last couple years though after Ta-Nehisi Coates. But like there's more a pattern of racism than the pattern of Abraham Lincoln's, right? I think that is part of his issue. Back to who he's intending this for. Would you say, so we're saying all of America, but over here, here's where this gets complicated. He's directing the personal part of the open letter to his Black son, right? Is he directing the wider audience to Black Americans, to white Americans, to some mixture of both? Like, what do you think his purpose is in this essay, and who's he trying to get?
I
Yeah.
think it's the goal, but I think it's a little bit more, not necessarily just white Americans, but anyone who is Black American.
Okay.
Just because, right, he is describing like life as a Black person in America and like his expectations of things, but obviously a lot of Black Americans would relate to that very easily. There's still stuff in there for them,
Yes.
but it's more of a almost like how Frederick Douglass like wrote it to like show people how slavery is, like it's almost like he's writing this to show like people like what the culture is like and
I totally agree with that. Yeah. I think that this is, I'm gonna put it, the NPR crowd. I think he wrote this book for kind of elitist liberal types. And I think kind of in probably more geared towards the white elitist liberal types for that specific reason. Let me explain what my experience is like with my son and what my son's experience is like so that you will fully understand what this experience, or not fully, but you'll understand a little bit better what this experience is like. Yeah, so isn't that interesting that he's trying to balance these two audiences? He's trying to like teach sort of non-Black Americans about what it means to be Black through the lens of directing his letter to his Black son. So what I want you to do under effects here, talk with the people next to you, just the same people you always talk to, talk with the people next to you and figure out why that would be a good strategy for this piece of rhetoric, to have an open letter strategy like that.
Because it's showing exactly how he feels without trying to like just stating facts.
yeah.
Yes, I completely agree. Like so many people walk up and say like how dare you say that. That's something I hate about when people get mad about this. Like, you don't have to read it. And it's just pretty ingenious how he does it. Because he knows that there's probably going to be some backlash. Like, it's very controversial subject. But he's doing it the way that like.
That's true. Luke was saying that this was a really good part of the book.
You did? Awesome. That is good eye.
Yeah.
You were right. Okay, make sure you write down what the effect is of having that sort of double audience. Think about how through like educating his son, he gets to educate a wider audience.
Actual argument that the person that the house trying to do because those like last year talking about
last 7 minutes of class, just to talk about sort of the basic argument here, and then we'll get into more of the specifics next time. So, he is thinking about in this, he's thinking about American myths. And by myths, I don't think he's necessarily, well, he is discounting them as untrue, but I'm not necessarily. When I say American myths, I'm saying like the ideals that our country has like devoted their attention to and put their faith in as a way to like build the country up and make it better. When he's talking about myths in this, though, he's also talking about the fact that myths can be discredited and that they can be used to hurt other people. And there's 4 myths that he's talking about in this. 1, race is real. One of the myths of our country is that race is a real thing and that we've made lots of decisions based on the fact that race is real. He's attacking the myth that you can advance with hard work, which is basically the American dream, that you can change your status based on how hard you work. He's thinking about the myth that America is innocent, that maybe we've done some bad things, but ultimately we're on the side of righteousness. And then he's attacking this myth that America was ordained by God. So this is where he's looking at the idea that we deify democracy. We're like, oh, democracy, that is a system that was like inspired by God. And he's saying that's a myth that has served like to keep some people in power and some people out of power, right? So he's thinking about these 4 myths in the first part of this essay. And I think this first one is all we'll get to today. But this is a quotation from the first part. Race is the child of racism, not the father. Will someone explain to me what he means by that, Kaylee?
So he's saying that the people who are racist aren't doing it because this race thing is actually real. He's saying the people who are racist, it's not because they saw this difference and they decided that it was bad. They just created a difference so they could say something bad.
Yeah. So this is the motivation, right? And this is the quote unquote difference. And you're saying that they had the motivation to create the difference, so they invented race as a way to create difference. What's his, yeah, Brennan?
I think he's kind of pointing out, or he's attacking the idea that it's it's a real thing that you can measure. It's kind of he's kind of saying that it's pretty dumb if you really think about it. What does that mean? If you're half black or quarter black, does that
Yeah.
make you? And also, if you look at a lot of like bigoted people or extremist groups like KKK, they kick someone out. Well, I mean, back in the day, like 100 years ago, they considered Irish people weren't real white
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Or Italians aren't so actually white.
Right.
The whole concept of what makes you white is a fake, not.
Okay, good. So not only is he saying that race is not real, that race, well, not only is he saying that racism invented race, but that he's saying that the white race, like being white, that's not a real thing. Do you think he says the same about being black? Jesse?
I think you could argue that's true. I think it's not, I think it's more so that like, right, it's race isn't a real thing because you'll have white people living in poverty, you'll have black people living in rich areas. So
Yeah.
it's more so like what makes people different is, oh, you're black and white, but it's like the culture that you grow up with.
Yeah.
So he's saying, I don't know how to word this the way I want to.
Do you think that he's then saying that there is no real difference between, like, culturally, socially, like there is no real difference between black and white? Like, is he arguing some sort of colorblind argument where he's like, there's actually no difference that we can? Yeah, Audrey?
I think his argument is kind of you can't really put like white as a race. It's so like such a big blend, but like you can link it back to like Irish culture, or, like
Yeah.
English culture, whatever your white stems from, but black comes from like, American. He's saying like it's kind of like more gray area for being white, but like yeah, I have a white culture, have like your origin culture.
Uh-huh.
It's like that's what black.
But white, yeah, white to him just means in power.
Yeah, it's just how-
Yeah, yes, Alistair.
As when the slaves were brought over,
Okay, yeah. Yes, and I think that's a huge part of this, right? So racism to him this is what is causing this sort of like distinction between races, right? And once that distinction is created, when one race is constantly oppressed and moved into a certain sort of like category, caste system, we might say, in a society, they maintain that racial distinction. It's almost like they can't get rid of this part of it, right? So they maintain that racial distinction while the other groups can change around in that racial distinction as much as they want. So he talks about Irish people becoming white. At some point, white people were sort of, their numbers were declining. So let's let in the Irish people so we can maintain that kind of hierarchy. All right, we're gonna return to this when we get back. It's super interesting. And then we'll talk about how he is actually making this argument. Yeah, I'll just look at the annotations next time. No, we don't have new homework for next time.
Because I don't want to.
I gotta know if it